I imagine some of you are thinking, finally, a book about a woman, because it seems like men dominate Scripture. And what do? I turn it and make it about a man. I promise we're going to give Esther her time, and we're going to think about her influence and her part in the story. It's kind of challenging to preach a narrative, which is a fancy word for a story. Because it's not written or meant to be taken apart and, looked at chapter by chapter. It's meant to tell us a story. It's meant to move us. It's meant to be read in one sitting so that you experience the beginning, you're biting your nails in the middle, and then you're celebrating and high-fiving each other at the end. And so it's really tough to look at it Sunday by Sunday, to get some spiritual application for our lives out of it, but also to be true to it as a narrative. There's something unique about Esther that no other book, 65 other books, are different than this one book. Anybody know what? I mean, obviously the title, okay, but something unique about Esther that's different than every other single book of the Bible? Yeah, it never once. 10 chapters. There's not a single mention of God in all 10 chapters. So as a pastor, that's a challenge. How am I going to find God in a book that doesn't mention God? You've probably read it through, and God's there. He's almost conspicuous by his absence. And we're going to see God working. But it's a beautiful story. It's probably one of the most, in my opinion, in my worthless opinion, it's probably one of the best written stories in all of Scripture. The way it takes you on this trip and the contrasts it gives you, the characters it develops, the twists it has in it, it's a fascinating story. And so we're going to try to appreciate the story over the next 3 Sundays. We're going to look at this book. I mentioned it's a historical narrative. So epistles, what Paul writes, or we just got finished with James. James writes an epistle. He's writing a letter to a church that's meant to be studied. It's meant to be kind of taken apart, and you look at the verses, and he's writing truth, like propositional truth, ideas, and you can study them and figure out what he's saying to us as a church. But a historical narrative is not written for you it's not written to say this is theology or this is truth. It tells us a story, and through the story it teaches us a lot of truth. But we're going to try to take those 2 parts. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of it, and then I want to talk to you about the narrative, the story. And we're just going to start by looking at Xerxes, one particular main character in the story. Next Sunday we're going to look at Esther. And then the 3rd Sunday, we're going to look at Haman and Mordecai Haman and Mordecai kind of contrasted with each other. One thing that's interesting about Scripture, it is historically accurate, but it is not history. We have a very different mindset about history now than they did, than Scripture has. Scripture was not written to tell us everything that happened. It is written to tell us a theological perspective on what happened historically. So as the biblical authors sat down to write, their purpose was not, I want to make sure that I get a full and detailed historical account of what happened. Does that make sense? Their purpose is, I want God to speak to his people, and I want to use historical events as the messenger, as the vehicle that I'm going to use to deliver God's message. And so there is history in the Bible, and Esther is historical, but it's not written to be a history. It's not written primarily to say, I want to tell you about what happened in the Persian Empire. It's written primarily to tell us about God and how he works with his people. It's written to tell us a lesson, and it uses history to do so. So let's talk about the history a little bit. If you just open your Bible and look, let's see, the Old Testament is about this part of my Bible. So now if you look, and Esther's right here, where would you think Esther comes in the history of the Old Testament? You might think it comes in the middle, because it's about in the middle of the Old Testament. It comes before Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. But the Bible, the Old Testament, and you probably knew this, and I'm not trying to trick you, the Old Testament is written, it's kind of categorized by genres more than chronological. Malachi is one of the latest books, one of the last books of the Old Testament, so it fits that it's the very last book that we have in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament isn't arranged chronologically, where the books at the beginning happen first and the books at the end happen last. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are some of the last books, some of the events that happened all the way at the end of the Old Testament. So even though Esther's kind of in the middle of the Old Testament, the only books that come after Esther, the only books whose action takes place after Esther, are most of Ezra, the entire book of Nehemiah, and then Malachi. All of those come after the story we have in Esther. So if you're following, we've got Abraham, and Abraham becomes the nation of Israel in Egypt, and then there's the Exodus, and then who's the first king of Israel? Wow, I was going to say David. Thank you very much for helping me. Saul was, yes, of course, like I said, Saul. And then David comes, and then Solomon, and after Solomon, what happens? Yeah, there's a split. So you get the southern, and which works for Americans, you get the southern kingdom and the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. Which the south, north and the south, we understand civil war. We understand a civil war by geography. We understand a civil war by north and south. So that works with Israel. They have a split. It's really not really a split. It's all of Israel against Judah. And I think one other tribe, Benjamin maybe, went with Judah. But basically it's 10 tribes against 2 tribes. So, it's not technically a 6 against 6 split. You've got the northern kingdom, which was more pagan, didn't follow God as much. There were several good kings in the southern kingdom, so they stayed. Assyria, which is basically what we would think of as Iraq, that area, comes over and takes over the northern kingdom pretty early. The southern kingdom continues a little bit longer, and then what king comes and takes the southern kingdom, takes Judah? Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, if you're sitting there thinking, how in the world am I supposed to know any of these questions you're asking me? Don't worry at all. Probably 80% of us don't know any of the answers to these questions. There's few that really enjoy history. So if you're not a history buff and you don't know any of this, you're just as good a Christian as the person next to you. This does not qualify you for a good Christian. It's just historical. It's interesting to some of us. Okay, so the northern kingdom has already been taken by Assyria, and then Babylon conquers Assyria, and Babylon, it's kind of like these mega powers. Assyria was the mega power, they take the northern kingdom. Then Babylon becomes the mega power. Babylon takes over Assyria as well as takes over the southern kingdom. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem and says, you must be a servant country, a vassal kingdom of me. And they say, okay, sure, we'll do whatever you tell us to. Then they don't. They try to get other treaties. So he comes back again in 586 BC and just destroys Jerusalem completely. So that, if there's no other date that you remember, that's a big one. 586. 586 is the fall of Jerusalem. Basically the end of this. For Israel, it's the end of the kingdom until, the 40s. 60s? I don't remember. So 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, comes and destroys Jerusalem. Now, a lot of the Jews, most of the Jews, are taken to Babylon. In 539, 50 years after Jerusalem falls, Babylon is now the big dog, the big country. Now another kingdom comes to power, which is Persia. And Persia takes over Babylon. So first you've got Assyria that takes the northern kingdom. Babylon kind of rises and takes Assyria. Now Persia rises and takes Babylon. And all of these countries are right in the Iraq-Iran area. Persia now becomes the world power and the big dog country. You can read about that in Daniel, where Persia comes in to Babylon and destroys it in a night, and Babylon falls in a single night. You've got Cyrus, and then Cyrus is the king of Persia, and he says people can start going. He sends the Jews back to Jerusalem. They've been exiles. It's like Germany takes over America and brings all the Americans to Germany, and then Cyrus comes and says, okay, you may go back to your home country. You may go back to America, which is a huge, wonderful event for the Jews. And they start to go back to their home, but a lot of them stay in Babylon where they were, and a lot of them are now in Persia, in Susa. Cyrus, and then comes Darius. And Darius is another king we read about in Scripture. And then after Darius comes our king from Esther chapter 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. If you have the NIV Bible, what does the NIV say? Now in the days of Xerxes, which is interesting. The NIV tries to make the Bible easier to understand. And there's a 90% chance that Ahasuerus and Xerxes are the same person. And so to make it all simple, and as you can see by your handout, we're going to go with the assumption that they're the same person. The NIV just says plain out they are the same person. When you do the timeline, it seems like this king is Xerxes, the king of Persia. And it makes sense because there are different names for different people. Actually, I was looking up in Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge, and there's actually a hieroglyphic name for him. You know, his name was a hieroglyphic. And then the Greeks gave him this name Xerxes. So nobody in Persia, if you said, hey, where's Xerxes? Nobody in Persia would know who you're talking about. Xerxes is actually the Greek name for this king. And the reason we know the Greek name, and the Greek name is the most famous name, is because of Herodotus, which was a Greek historian. We're going to talk about him in a second. So we're just going to go with the assumption that Xerxes and Ahasuerus are the same person. It seems like they are, and it makes sense historically for the dates and everything. Xerxes, by the way, I know I've lost half of you, and just come on back. We're getting there, okay? Bear with me. Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BC. From 486 to 465. When did Jerusalem fall? That was the important date. You guys remember that one? 586. So we're talking 100 years after Jerusalem has fallen. Xerxes comes to power and reigns. Now there's some interesting dates. Look at chapter 1, verse 3. It says, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The third year of his reign, if he reigned in 486, the third year would be what? 483. Technically a little geek, historical geek. It could be 482 as well because our calendars don't line up. So it depends what part of the third year of his reign. But we're going to go with 483. This feast that he gives is in 483. And then if you'll turn over to chapter 2, verse 16. It says, when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So the feast that starts the story is in 483 BC, and that's the third year. In the 7th year, Esther goes to the king, and that's in the 7th year, which is 4 years later. So if the feast was in 483, Esther was chosen as queen in 479. Okay? We got 480. The text itself gives us these two dates, and it gives us one more. 483 BC is when the feast is. 479 is when Esther is chosen as queen. Now this is what's interesting. The text doesn't tell us anything about what happens between those two dates. But we know a lot about what happens in between those two dates because of this Greek historian, Herodotus. Xerxes' father was Darius. Darius was ruling in Persia. Susa, which is where this is located, is right on the border of Iran and Iraq, on the Iran side. if you've heard of Basra, it's a little bit north and east of Basra in the Middle East. It's now called Shush in Iran, but it comes from the same town, Susa, which was the capital of the Persian Empire. So he's over there in Iran, Darius is, and Darius takes his whole army, gathers all his army together, and invades Greece in 490. So before Xerxes comes to reign in 486, 490, Darius takes his whole army, invades Greece, and there's a famous battle. Anybody know the battle? Seattle? That's the next battle. That's his son's battle. But Darius loses at the Battle of Marathon, which is where we get our marathon from, the run. He comes, he loses, we won't get into all that. He loses that marathon and he goes home. And kind of like the Bushes, the son comes to power and the son says, I'm going to finish what my dad started. So the son now gathers all of his armies together again. This is where it starts to really get interesting. You get secular history and biblical history. We know there's this huge party. And in chapter 1, it tells us he has all these people coming to Susa, all these people coming to Susa. He's showing off all of his wealth. You start to think, why is he showing? What is he doing in 483? It could very well be that he's getting ready in 480 in 480 now, the son, Xerxes, does the same thing his father does, gathers together this huge army, gathers together all of these countries that are under him and takes all of their armies with him and invades Greece. They invade, and there's a battle called the Battle of Thermopylae. Have you ever heard of that one? King Leonidas has 300 Spartans and about 700 other soldiers, and they find a narrow passageway, and they hold up this battle of tens and hundreds. Herodotus says up to 1,000,000, but that seems kind of like fanciful talk. So we'll say tens or hundreds of thousands of Persians coming at them. And about 1,000 Greeks hold them in this pass for a long time. They eventually Persia defeats, but then they lose a sea battle. In 480, he loses a sea battle and he goes home. Just like his father lost at Marathon and went home, he loses at the Battle of Salamis, which is what Seattle mentioned, and Xerxes takes his army home. Now what's interesting, we're going to get into the story. Do you remember, if you're vaguely familiar, he has this huge party, he's showing off, he wants to show people how powerful he is. He wants to inspire them to come fight with him. So he says, hey Vashti, come show the people how beautiful my wife is. And Vashti, what? Vashti says no. Vashti refuses. How embarrassing is it? Not just as a man, not just as a king, but as a king who's trying to inspire people to come, to follow him, who needs people to do what he tells them to. When he says, all of your armies are going to come with me and we're going to fight the Greeks like my father did 10 years ago, he needs people to say yes, and his own queen says no. So he goes, he fights, he loses, he comes home. Now look at chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. I probably would never have put all this together, but I was reading Daylin's Bible study of Beth Moore's on the book of Esther, and it's beautiful what a woman brings to a passage that a man misses. You start to put the dates together. A king has just lost at war and comes home. What does a man need when he comes home from a loss, from a defeat? What is better than anything to restore a man's... some of you are snickering, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a woman's comfort, a woman's touch. He needs a wife. Here's a king who has just lost at battle and comes home to no queen, no wife to comfort him and to build him back up. And so it says, after these things, when the king of Ahasuerus, 479, is when he chooses Esther. He remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. What can build his ego again? What can get him his spirits back up again? And they come up with a plan for him. All right, so Here's where we are. Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465. The feast was 483. His invasion to Greece was in 480. He chose Esther as queen in 479. He is a fascinating part of this story because the author of Esther presents Xerxes as an incredibly ironic character. Xerxes is an ironic character. There's no doubt from the very first verse of the book that he's the most powerful person in the story. He is the authority. He is the top dog. He's the general. He's the president. He's the chancellor. He's the one with the final say. He's the one with all the authority and all the power. So 1:1-9, he is rich and he lives in luxury. The whole point, let's read those verses together. In the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia. So right away, this is the one who reigned over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains. Now, if you've got a mental clip note, notice these colors and keep them in the back of your mind. Not for this Sunday, but for weeks to come. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. There were also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. The normal policy for drinking, I'm told, or I read, is that you only drink when the king drinks. It's not a free open bar. It's the king drinks or he does a toast and then you're allowed to drink. When the king's not drinking, you're not drinking. But he changed it and he says there's no compulsion. The king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Let them drink as much as they want. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Xerxes or Ahasuerus. So he is rich and he lives in luxury. The narrator, the storyteller, wants us to get this picture of this rich, luxurious king. And then he's powerful and famous. There's an inscription that's been found on one of the foundation stones in Susa, in Shush, in Iran. There's a movie that's been made recently where they wanted to portray this. And the picture I'm about to show you is not at all historically accurate. It has nothing to do with what he actually looked like, but it's Hollywood's attempts for us to get a picture of what he would have looked like to his people. So pop the picture up while I read this instead of having the text up. I am Xerxes, the great king, the only king, the king of all countries which speak all kinds of languages, the king of this entire big and far-reaching earth, the son of King Darius the Achaemenian, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan of Aryan descent. This is what he wrote. Thus speaks King Xerxes. These are the countries, in addition to Persia, over which I am king under the shadow of Ahura Mazda, over which I hold sway, which are bringing their tribute to me. Listen to this. Whatever is commanded them by me, that they do, and they abide by my law. And then he goes through about 20 different countries that he is king of kings over. All right, Josh, thank you. Probably don't need that image in our minds any longer. So this is Xerxes. This is king of kings, king over kings. Whatever I command, they do. And this is the ironic part. There's no doubt from verse 1, he is the most powerful character in the story, but the irony is he also is the weakest character in the story. Hopefully you're going to read Esther. Hopefully maybe yesterday in the Bible reading we read Esther 1-3. We got 4 to 6, and then 6 to 10 coming up. As you read, notice everything he says. Notice the edicts, the laws that he gives, but then think about where did they come from? Whose idea were they? When he gives a command, when he gives a law, were they his idea or were they someone else's idea? And take note of that as you go through the book of Esther. He's not only the strongest character, he's also the weakest character in the book. So in 10 to 22, we talked about, he tells Vashti, I want you to come and impress everybody. And Vashti tells him no. So the very first chapter, what the narrator sets up for us is Xerxes is unbelievably powerful, and Vashti tells him no, which creates the drama we need to get Esther into the story. It opens the spot for Esther to become part of the story. But it's interesting that the most powerful character in the story, the very first story that's told about the most powerful character in the story, is someone flat out refusing what they want her to do. Another thing to tuck in the back of your minds as you read through Esther. Mordecai is going to do the exact same thing. Mordecai is going to flat out refuse to do what the king tells him to do. It's like a reminding us. Vashti refuses, and look at what happens to Vashti. And then Mordecai says, no, I will not do what the king commands me to do. And you're set up to say, we already know what happens to people who refuse the king. Vashti, the story of Vashti tells you what happens to people who say no to Xerxes. So find out what happens to Mordecai when he tells Xerxes no. The narrative twice turns on Xerxes, the all-powerful king of all kings, not getting what he wants. The first time is Vashti. The second time we'll look at in a couple weeks is my favorite part of the story. Notice, so he tells Vashti that he wants her to come. Vashti says no, and then in verse 13, the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment. We're going to jump down to verse 15. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of king and officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Part of the reason I chose this passage for this day, for Father's Day, there's these paranoid men thinking if we don't keep our power, all the women are going to rebel against all the wives. And we've got to keep them under the thumb. And if Vashti defies you and you don't do anything about it, then all the wives will have reason and precedence to defy all of their husbands. And we're going to have bedlam in the nation because the wives aren't going to do what their husbands tell them to do. This picture of a man, of a father, being the one with all the power, one with all the authority, it has traditionally been the concept of what a man and a father is supposed to be. But it's ironic that in this book, even that picture is shown to be shallow. You've got Mordecai who basically adopts Esther. And we're going to talk next week. There's beautiful verses about Esther's respect and the way she honored Mordecai. But then there's also a verse as you get into the heart of the chapter where it says, and Mordecai did everything that Esther told him to do. A man's man is not just about how powerful you are and about how rich and luxurious you are. It's not about how many people you have under your thumb. And this book betrays the shallowness of the power of Xerxes. So they all say to him, you've got to do something or this is going to set a bad precedent. So in verse 20, it says, when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdoms, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. Who's in charge? Who's obeying whom in that verse? Are you catching it? The king did what he was told to do. The all-powerful one carried out someone else's idea. Watch that develop throughout the book. 22, he sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. You know, that's the kind of verse where the men are like, yeah, that's what we want. What's the irony of the verse? Why is Xerxes giving this command? Because Xerxes is not master of his own household. Xerxes' authority is defied, and so in response to the defiance of Vashti, he pronounces an edict through all his kingdom: men must be respected in their households. What we're going to find is Xerxes is not only not a master of his own household, Xerxes is not master of himself. What condition was Xerxes in when he gave the command for Vashti to be brought to him? He was drunk. Turn back to chapter 1. On the 7th day, in verse 10, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman and all these others, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. Have any men ever had bad ideas when they were drunk? Isn't it nice to know some things don't change? So Xerxes, the picture that's painted is this all-powerful king who doesn't have control over himself, who gives up control of himself. He gives up control of himself to alcohol. He gives up control of himself, you're going to see, to his advisors. He gives up control of himself to his passions and his whims and his desires. He is impulsive. He does whatever strikes him, whatever hits him. Socrates is a contemporary of Xerxes, and we talked a couple months ago about Socrates. What did Socrates say about the tyrant? The tyrant is not in control of himself. The tyrant is driven by the great drones, by their desires. And they do what the drones of their desires sting them and tell them to do. And that's the picture you begin to get of Xerxes is, here's this all-powerful man, king, who is not in control of himself, who is a servant to alcohol, who is a servant to his appetites. Watch for feasts, watch for parties, watch for meals, watch for alcohol throughout this story. When you want Xerxes to do what you want Xerxes to do, guess what you do for Xerxes? You feed him and you get him drunk, which is a powerful story here. The most powerful man in the kingdom can be manipulated, can be controlled through his passions, through his appetites, through his desires. He is controlled by his appetites, his desires, and his impulses. There's going to be later in the story almost a comical situation where he misreads the situation so badly and he impulsively reacts to what he thinks is going on, Xerxes, because he sees and he acts. He sees and he reacts. He doesn't have a plan that he's working towards. He doesn't have a goal and a purpose that he's driving towards. He's like a pinball bouncing around, especially as he's portrayed in this story. In turn, anyone who can steer his impulses steers him. I remember as a boy, I had 3 older brothers, and it was like their favorite thing in the world to pick on their youngest brother. At least that was my worldview growing up, is that my brothers just picked on me nonstop. If you talk to my brothers, it's interesting. They have a different recollection of history. But they would get me angry. And then I would get angry and I would lose it. And I can remember I had this one move where I'd just swing my arms, just, as hard and as fast as I could. That was actually the technique right there. And I'd go at them. And my parents would say, Duane, when you lose your temper, when seeing red, the blind rage, you stop thinking and you just start acting. When you do that, you are letting your brothers control you. And I'm not. I'm in control. I'm the one deciding to get angry. I'm the one deciding to punch them as hard as I can. But then I started thinking about it. They controlled me. They decided what I would do. They would push a certain button, and I, like a trained dog would, I know you don't push buttons on dogs, but they'd ring a bell. That one works. They'd ring a bell, and like a trained dog, I would react. I would do what they told me to do. I would get angry when they told me to get angry. Do you understand what I'm saying? Kids, this is an important concept. Husbands, this is an important concept. When you are controlled by your anger, you are turning over your anger. You are turning over yourself to anybody who can get you angry, now has control over you. And what we're going to see throughout Esther is that anybody who knows Xerxes, who can figure him out, figure out his passions, figure out his desires, figure out his impulses, you can play Xerxes like a puppet. The most powerful man in the story is played like a puppet, first by Haman, who rises to power and is basically the one calling the shots, the one deciding what happens in the kingdom of Persia. But then the beautiful thing is, Esther says, you know what? I can play him as well as you can play him. You think you've got him wrapped around your finger. I'll give a go at that. I think I can dangle King Xerxes as a marionette. I think I can make him dance. I think I can make him sing. And it's this battle between Haman's control over Xerxes and Esther's control over Xerxes. And Xerxes is the puppet. The most powerful man in the kingdom is the puppet of Haman and Esther. What's wrong with that picture? Anyone who steers his impulses steers him. So it leaves us asking the question. It leaves us having to ask the question, who controls you? Who's playing you? What impulses, what desires, what passions drive you? I wrote some of these down as I was thinking through it. Do your appetites tell you what to do and when to do it? Daylin has a time of day that she stops eating desserts and sweets. I eat desserts and sweets whenever they tell me to eat them. They are my boss, and when they say eat me, I say yes, sir. What controls you? Are your appetites your boss? Does your anger control you? Do you lose your temper to a point where you are no longer in control of the words you say, the things you do, the tone you use? Are you a puppet of your anger? Does your ambition, your desire for a promotion, your desire for that next place control you? Does it tell you what to do? Does it tell you how long to stay at work? Does it tell you when to leave your family? Is it the boss? Is it the drone that stings you and says, do this, do this, do this? Are you controlled by a desire to please people? Does the approval of people dictate to you what you will and will not do, what you will and will not say, how you will or will not dress? Teenagers, do your friends tell you who you are, what kind of music you like, what kind of clothes you wear? Who tells you who you are and what you are and what's important to you? That hit me like a brick one time. I was flying back to the States as a teenager, and I was wearing clothes that in Germany, my friends told me these are cool clothes. Not literally, you understand, but I looked at all of them, and they were all wearing them, so these were cool clothes. I got off the plane in America, and everybody there told me, these aren't cool clothes here anymore. It wasn't the clothes that changed. All of a sudden it hit me how random and how arbitrary fashion is. That people just decide, those are cool clothes, those are ugly clothes. And the clothes don't change, but people's opinion changes, and then I have to change. I have to change my clothes because this group of people tells me that these are ugly clothes now in this new country I'm in. What tells you how to dress? Does your desire for love or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a husband or a wife control you? Dictate to you what you're going to do and how you're going to do it? Does your desire for a possession or a house or a car or a video game control you? Dictate to you what you're going to do and how you're going to do it? Does fear control you? Does it tell you what you're going to do and how you're going to do it? I doubt if you asked Xerxes who's in charge of this kingdom, he never would have said Haman's in control of the kingdom. He never would have said Esther's calling the shots. Anytime you would have asked Xerxes who's in charge, he wrote it on a building. I am Xerxes, the great king, the only king, the king of all countries. And yet, as we step back and look at him, we can see he's not only being influenced, he is being controlled by the people around him. And you might think, I'm in control of my life. I'm calling the shots. But are you really? What are you being influenced by? And beyond influence, what are you being controlled by? What desires, drives, and motives are telling you what to do? And once you figure that out, you probably don't have to go very far to figure out who's behind them that's using them to control you. Because if your boss knows what can control you, if your boss knows what you fear, if the people around you know what your passion, what you lust after, it is very easy to control someone once you know what they serve, once you know what they bow down to, what they will not defy, what they will obey. You control that, and you control them. Ultimately, in a spiritual world, something and someone is supposed to control us, right? Let me try that one more time. Something or someone is supposed to control us, right? As Christians. We're supposed to be marionettes on strings. We're supposed to be dancing when God tells us to dance. We're supposed to be talking when God tells us to talk. That's part of the package. That we give our lives to God and say, you will control me. But God will not control us if we choose to bow down and worship the appetites, pleasures, and impulses. If we let them tell us what to do. So who controls you?